Robert, that's the session being recorded.
That's it.
So a huge welcome, thank you. A huge welcome to everybody who's joined our webinar today. My name is Gillian McNeil and I'm a speech language therapist at Call Scotland. And it's my job to introduce the presenters that we have. And I'm really delighted to welcome Lesley-Anne Anderson and Amy Hanschell to lead us today. Lesley-Anne and Amy are both speech and language therapists at NHS Tayside in Scotland. They work with adult acquired caseload, clients with adult acquired conditions, both in hospitals and within the community. And we are really looking forward to hearing from them about their approaches and experiences in relation to voice and message banking for clients. And I'm sure you'll have some useful insights on what you've learned with that. So the webinar is due today to run through to 4:30. I expect that you both would like to have questions today, Lesley-Anne and Amy. You can use the chat, participants can use the chat if you would like to, and you can access that using the chevron, the purple chevron on the bottom right of your screen. If you open that up, you'll see the chat bubble. If you click on that icon, you'll get access to the chat. So there's an opportunity to pop any questions in there, and hopefully at the end of the webinar there'll be about 5 minutes or so for a wee bit of further sort of questions or discussions. So I'd just like to pass over then to you both to lead our webinar today.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and thanks very much for having me on this afternoon. This is an area of practice for us that's really progressed rapidly over the past few years, and we've really struggled to keep pace of the change. So this is really not going to be kind of training on how to do voice banking, and just a caveat before we start, we're definitely not experts in this area. But what we hope to demonstrate is what we've learned and reflected on over the past few years, and which potentially can raise some discussion points and help kind of move things forward a little bit.
So just to get us started around what voice banking is exactly. Voice banking is a process for creating a personalised synthetic voice, or a synthetic approximation of a person's natural voice. So the process of voice banking creates an individual computer-generated voice that's created from a set of recordings. The synthetic voice can then be used with a high-tech AAC system to communicate messages, and in my experience that's primarily through text-to-speech, but it's not limited to that. The recent literature in the area and our own experiences tell us that using a banked voice can contribute to retention of a person's identity, where their voice is a function that they may lose. However, we also know that synthetic voices can't fully emulate natural voice with all its melodic intonation and personality that comes along with that. And our role is also around supporting expectations, and that's something that we found to be quite important. Voice banking is a service provided by a range of online suppliers, all differing slightly from number of phrases that need to be recorded, the recording equipment that's required, the cost, the quality of the end voice, and also what AAC systems and platforms that voice will work on. So I think we agree it's a bit of a minefield.
So just to give a shout out as well to kind of message banking, which is that it's slightly different in that it uses direct recordings of a person's voice, retaining all the nuances and characteristics of that person's speech. But this means that there's a finite amount of messages that can be recorded. But we feel that it's a really nice complement to voice banking, and certainly a lot of the voice banking suppliers have incorporated that into kind of their recording platforms. But we'll return to message banking a wee bit further on in some more detail.
So who can bank their voice? Well, anyone can bank their voice, really. Any of you can do it at any time. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists tells us that anyone at risk of voice change or loss with the ability to use high technology AAC may benefit from both voice banking and message banking, as Amy said. Most of our clinical experience has been with people with motor neuron disease, and we've had a few people bank their voice who have a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. But we think this area of practice will continue to expand rapidly over the coming years. And in addition to potential users of AAC themselves, we recognise the potential of voice donation or voice banking by proxy, where a person may already have lost their speech, which could provide AAC users who've had a stroke or a head injury as well with an opportunity to create a more personalised voice to use with their device. And we're also considering whether voice banking could offer our existing long-term AAC users something additional to the devices and the systems that they're already using when it comes to their routine reviews. We've also had a couple of people on our caseload who use text-to-speech to augment communication following head and neck cancer treatment. So just in our discussions between ourselves, we've started to wonder whether in a case where a treatment may result in a change to someone's speech function, whether this is something that would be worth exploring with them.
So where do we as speech and language therapists or AAC practitioners more broadly fit into this process of voice banking? Well, I suppose our learning has been framed by two quite early experiences that we have had, which will hopefully demonstrate some of the points that we have up on the slide. Voice banking for me was first raised by a patient who had MS about 4 or 5 years ago, who had seen it on a news item on the television. And for me, I had really no idea where to start, so contacted SCTCI for some support. And I think just as an aside, with AAC the field of AAC progressing so rapidly, having centres of expertise like SCTCI and CALL are really invaluable to us as kind of practitioners. So I was curious to see what was involved in voice banking and had spoken to our managers here about supporting this gentleman to do the recording process. We also agreed that we could fund it through our AAC budget alongside a high-spec microphone that was needed at that time to do the recording. So Model Talker was one of the few providers that was available at that time, and that's the supplier that we went with. They were extremely supportive in helping us getting started with the recording process. This gentleman didn't have a PC or laptop to do the recording on, which is not unusual in this day and age. So we recommissioned an obsolete AAC Windows device to do the recording on, which also allowed us to play around with some alternative access for him to keep him directly involved in the recording process. I think going forward into the future though, having to provide equipment for voice banking will become less and less of an issue. I know that kind of many of the voice banking suppliers are looking to provide their kind of recording platform on a tablet or Windows technology, which would make it much easier for us and much more accessible for our patients. So recording for this gentleman at the time was a real faff. It was really highly sensitive. We had to do things like turning off the fridge, shutting the dog out, closing the curtains, do multiple takes for the recording of each sentence. At that time, Model Talker required at least 1,200 sentences, and it became a really kind of laborious process for this gentleman, and it quickly became apparent that it wasn't going to be achievable. And then we actually abandoned the recording process, which was a bit disappointing. But despite this, I felt that the time we had spent with him had been really valuable in kind of building that early therapeutic relationship, and also having really early conversations about AAC and what a communication system might mean to him in the future. Our second experience with voice banking was almost the polar opposite. We received a really timely referral from our specialist MND specialist nurses. This person had already looked into voice banking and what providers were available, and our role really was just to support that decision making. They had really strong technology preferences, and we were very aware of not restraining our final goal of the ideal communication or AAC system with the voice that was banked and was chosen. It's likely this person will be a highly proficient high-tech AAC user. So we supported that decision, and then this individual went away and did the recording themselves. Upon reflection, I think maybe having a little bit more involvement to have those conversations about what that voice will look like in the context of AAC, I think might have been quite useful. But it's not for everybody. Everybody's really different, and it just maybe wasn't the right time for that individual. So I think, coming to the conclusion, I think our role with voice banking will differ for each individual. But I think as speech and language therapists and AAC practitioners, I think we have a really key role in voice banking as a process, as we understand the kind of nuances of communication and where that voice will sit in that kind of wider AAC picture in the future.
So just moving on to what we would consider when looking at the appropriateness or whether we're going to be recommending or suggesting voice banking. And what you see on your screen is not an exhaustive list, but this is just what reflects our experiences so far. And I'm just going to try and talk through some of them. So first of all, is voice banking important? And if so, who is it important to? Now, we've already said that we know that it could play an important part in maintenance of identity for someone where they're over time losing more and more of their own voice. But we've also seen the priority placed on the banked voice or voice banking as a process by communication partners too, and that opens up a whole different discussion, which is quite interesting. And of course, another thing to consider is the quality of the person's speech at the time of recording, and there's a little bit more detail of that coming up in one of our case examples in a minute. You really have to take into consideration the person's existing skills and experiences. So their level of literacy, for example, they're going to be reading through many, many sentences to bank their voice, and also potentially using text to speech in the future. Any visual impairment they have, any technology experiences in digital literacy, all these things will impact on the endpoint AAC use. And it's not to say, of course, that high-tech skills can't be learned. We know that they can. And it's important, we'll keep coming back to this point, that to keep in mind that any voice generated should really complement the AAC system for the future and not compromise it. And it's the endpoint communication system that really matters. That's what we're doing this for, and that's what we're ultimately aiming towards. And we're having to project onto what we think the most likely system will be at quite an early stage in order to successfully bank a voice. So I've often thought it feels a bit of a gamble for someone to spend time banking their voice and have some expectations around that when we don't quite know what the end point is going to be. But a better term that I heard recently than my gamble was that it can be looked upon as an insurance policy for your voice. And again, just to reiterate a little bit of what Amy said, one of the biggest learning points is that one solution doesn't fit all, as with all AAC decision making. And in terms of future needs, we want to make sure that any suggestions that we make around voice banking isn't going to restrict someone's AAC options for the future. Instead, we really want to focus on it being complementary to the system that they use.
So just kind of taking that on, you know, there are some really good alternatives to voice banking when it's not an option. We really won't beat the build quality of standard synthetic voices, and with increasing choice and more regional accents and age-appropriate voices available, this is a real viable choice for us. However, we know that not all regional accents are available on all platforms, and this can really impact on our decision making. We know that communication is much more than text to speech and a voice, and we hope in our practice that our kind of AAC users are, you know, really proficient multimodal communicators. And we know of so many individuals who use their low-tech system not as a last resort, but as their kind of preferred method of communication. I'm mentioning message banking again, as we have one gentleman who has very limited literacy and for whom text-to-speech will not be an option once he loses his speech completely. However, what we've been doing is been trying to co-create a kind of a kind of grid-based system on an iPad app with him to kind of program in his own vocab and prior to him losing his speech. And message banking was an inbuilt feature to that system. And we have recorded some emotive phrases, some basic needs stuff in his own voice that he'll be able to use with that system. On reflection, I really wish that we had recorded some of his personal life stories that we have programmed, but we've just not message banked. I hadn't thought of it at the time. And I think that would have been really nice. I think those kind of one-liners, the timing of those stories that you tell to the same people all the time would have been a really nice touch. So that was a bit of learning for me. We've also already mentioned voice bank donation and voice banking by proxy, which is a really good alternative. And Lesley and I have spoken about this last one a couple of times about those people that we have in our caseloads who deliberately choose not to use a voice and require their communication partner either to come alongside them to read their message or to use their front-facing screen to read the message off. And this is, you know, fine, it's good, it's effective communication as well.
So we're just going to talk through another couple of examples from our experience. Two people who are currently on my caseload who have successfully banked their voice. And a little bit of thanks goes out to them. I'm going to give you a little bit of detail of their story, and they've also given us permission to play little snippets of their banked voice using dialogue that they generated for us for this purpose. So the first one is a gentleman who has banked his voice with Model Talker, and these are by no means reviews of any particular system. This is just to demonstrate two experiences with two different providers. So this gentleman is currently 41 years old. He has a diagnosis of motor neuron disease. He was 39 at the age of his diagnosis in February of last year, 2020. Now he was, as a lot of these people tend to be, a previously very fit and well man, no previous health concerns, sociable, active, lived with his family at the time, a preschool age child, and at the time of his diagnosis, he had very early bulbar symptoms and early upper limb weakness as well. So I suppose when you meet someone at that point, you're already projecting ahead to what their potential future AAC needs might look like. Now, I met him at home a month after his diagnosis, and in his referral to me, it stated, quote, that he was keen for voice banking. So I was going in knowing that this was a potential area for discussion. His speech was very mildly dysarthric, with reduced rate and reduced breath support at that time, but very mild, still of a good quality. He was familiar with Windows. He used computer software for work. He was and continues to be an Android phone user, and he was in fact keen to know more about voice banking and future AAC. So at that time, in the first visit, I was able to demonstrate text-to-speech with him through an iPad with a generic synthetic voice, just to give him an idea at that stage of what it is that he would be aiming for. So the process itself, at that time, this was fairly new to me. We had had a couple of experiences that Amy's already described, and based on his sort of experience and his anticipated need, I had suggested Model Talker as a provider at that time. Now, timing was key here for this man, and knowing him as I do now, I think had we not gone into lockdown and him being in a shielding position, there's a very good chance he wouldn't have got through this, because Model Talker required something in the region of 1,500 sentences to be recorded. And it just so happens that he was a bit of a captive audience at the time, going into that situation with lockdown. So he proceeded independently. I wasn't really at liberty to go out to see him as frequently either at the time, but he was pretty proficient. And by the end of March 2020, he'd completed 50% of the recordings that he needed to do. He really went for it. And it was fully completed and funded by our local AAC fund by June of last year. Now, he hasn't had a need for that until very recently. In fact, he's still using speech. But just this month, we've gone in and put into place a high-tech Windows-based system with eye gaze as an access method for him. He's primarily using it for some initial environmental control, but he does have text-to-speech with his voice downloaded onto the device. So this is two just quick examples. He gave the words, and this is his banked voice.
Whilst the prospect of reciting several thousand sentences was initially quite daunting, I actually came to enjoy the experience. The feature that allows the user to listen to a sample of their voice at any point in the process is great for many reasons, but mainly because it incentivized me to continue recording and make it sound better.
Thank you. Now, I know that you'd know this gentleman, but I can tell you from experience that it is quite a true likeness. It captures an element of him that is hard to explain. So it's been really successful. So we'll see how that goes as he comes to rely on AAC more and more. And the next example I want to give, we're not hanging around here for time's sake, but the next example I want to give is of a lady who has banked her voice with Speak Unique. And just a bit of brief history for this person as well. She's a 66-year-old lady. Again, no previous medical conditions, fitting well, enjoyed walking, very sociable. And she had started to suffer some falls and noticed that her speech was slurring in about April of this year. And she was diagnosed with motor neuron disease in June. She's a real family-orientated person, lives at home with her husband, she has adult children, and she was a childcare provider for her grandchildren at that time. She received a baseline speech and language therapy assessment during a hospital admission around about the time of her diagnosis. And at that time, her speech was fully intelligible with mild changes in nasality, but no issues with speech rate. Now, I saw her a month later at home, and her speech quality had changed. She was mildly dysarthric, but primarily characterised by reduced rate as a result of reduced articulatory precision. Her nasality was altered. And at that time, she was keen to know more about voice banking too. I think it was an empowerment thing. What can I do? This is something I can do. Her husband has a background in technology, and they were together keen to explore options independently with some guidance from speech and language therapy from my experience at that point. And she was familiar with iPads and iPhone as her sort of preferred tech. So as I say, I keep referring to them as the couple, and they were keen to know more, but they very much worked together to make this happen. I made two suggestions from my experience, really just for them to go and have a look at and investigate, and they were Speak Unique and Model Talker. And they proceeded independently with very little further guidance from me until it came to the point of refining the voice. She initially trialed Model Talker. They did very much do it together. And you'll see her feedback on Model Talker in the next slide. ultimately she banked her voice with Speak Unique, and you'll see why on the next slide as well. So she was really keen to give some specific feedback. She felt if it could help someone else, it was worth giving. And again, just to reiterate, this is not a review of systems. This is just to really demonstrate that different systems will work for different people for different reasons. And I hope what it shows is that there's no correct provider. The selection should be based on best fit for an individual with all the factors taken into consideration. So you'll see here for Model Talker, she said they needed 1,700 sentences recorded, but as my voice was less than clear, I had to repeat and repeat to perfect each one before I was permitted to move to the next one. This was impossible to do. She found it frustrating and exhausting. And with Speak Unique, she found it was easier to set up. It accepted her voice as it was. And they got quite quick turnaround with that. With both providers, they sought out some support from them, found them both to be very responsive, providing reassurance throughout the process, which was great. And when it came to refining the voice with Speak Unique, they really pulled out all the stops to get it right for her, gave her different selections, 5 different versions even in the first time around for her to have a listen to and choose from, which was great. Another thing that she commented on was she was really pleased to make use of a service that was developed and based in Scotland. That was something that was important to them. And her comment at the end there, which was really nice, was that her family recognise her within this programme, which is great. And then just to let you hear that voice.
I find it very useful when emotion takes over and I get to finish my sentence. Occasionally my voice gets tired, so again I use the voice.
So just really quickly, just to touch on another case that we had, which really demonstrated for us that either one or two solutions don't fit all. We had another person quite soon after diagnosis who was very motivated to voice bank, but whose key characteristic was that they were bilingual and used equally their first language and English in both work and personal circumstances. So it was really important that they were able to use both languages, and that will be a key feature in their future AAC system should they need one. And at the time, and this may have changed, things are changing so quickly, Model Talker and Speak Unique did not provide this service, so we had to identify a service that did, and Cereproc did. Now this was a little bit more expensive than we had been used to purchasing, but we felt we were really justified in using our AAC budget to fund this for this particular person.
So I know we're running a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to skip through just some of the things that run through our mind, some of the concerns that we have around getting it right for people. And just a little list we generated was, firstly, is it the right thing to do? Around that gamble and that dedication of time. Do I know enough to make a recommendation to someone? That's certainly something that I've thought about in my experience. How do you know it's going to be worth the person's time? Really setting people up with honest and realistic expectations is something that we've talked about often as being really important throughout our learning. And of course, being concerned that someone puts all that effort in and then not being able to use it on the platform that they need for AAC.
And we have got examples of when we haven't got it quite right, but we've not got time to go into them. Get back to us if you want to know more. Just really quickly, we've mentioned the AAC legislation in Scotland and that we've got a dedicated budget for AAC in Tayside that we feel that we can use for voice banking. We feel it's an important thing to provide. However, it's a finite budget, so we have to be really cost effective and look elsewhere for funding where there is possibility to do that. And you've had some.
Yeah, we are lucky in that MND Scotland will, for the past 2 years roughly, I might be wrong on that, but around about 2 years have funded Speak Unique for anyone with a diagnosis of motor neuron disease. But recently I had a chat through Teams with MND Scotland and offered them some feedback, just as we have today, around our experiences. And they've agreed to go back and consider whether they can offer funding for other voice banking providers too, just around avoiding restriction really for individuals.
So really quickly, moving forward, we feel it's really important to share our learning both with our direct speech therapy colleagues and our MDT colleagues who are coming across people kind of post-diagnosis, and really bridging that gap between the awareness of voice banking and what it will potentially be used for, which is what we want is a really effective communication system. So we're really keen to kind of push that idea of we start with the patient specifications first, and then we look for a voice banking supplier based on that. We feel it's really important to get kind of expectations right, as Lesley mentioned, and encouraging communication between patients and voice banking suppliers. I think that's something that I've learned from your lady, to get that voice as good as possible.
Yeah, they really sort of were looking for they really strove for the best possible outcome and got it.
I think thinking about our role and the possible, the time that we could spend doing this, whether or not we have the capacity to do this within our current workload is a point for discussion potentially. But we would like to be able to do this really well. To do AAC well is really important to us. So kind of that's something that we'll take moving forward. Keeping up to date with change is a big thing, and there's lots of the MND Association down south provide some really great training on voice banking, which we would highlight. And an ideal, maybe a little bit of blue sky thinking, and for us, just finishing up, wouldn't it be ideal if every voice worked on every platform, whether it's banked or the standardized voice? That would be a real wish list item for us and would make our lives really easy. Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's any time now for discussion or questions.
Sorry about that.
Well, thank you very much. That's been really interesting from you both, just to hear about the process that you've followed with voice banking and the sort of careful considerations that you've given to it. I haven't noticed any questions in the chat so far, but if there are any burning questions, I'm sure you would be interested. If anybody would like to put anything into the chat, you could maybe just allow a minute or two for that. Something I was just going to ask you was about voice banking by proxy. If are there difficult considerations as to who might voice bank for someone else, or do you think that's something that can be quite straightforward?
I think it's something that we haven't had a huge amount of experience with yet. But potentially it could. We're just thinking of the long-term AAC users on our caseload who may raise this maybe in their annual AAC review, that kind of thing. And is there a difference between a familiar person versus an unfamiliar person donating or voice banking their voice? I'm not sure. I'm sure it's a new area of practice for us.
I do have one gentleman on my caseload who also has a diagnosis of motor neuron disease. For him, it's too late to bank his own voice. And just in discussion with him, I hadn't thought about suggesting it as a by proxy, but it just came up in discussion. And his son showed some interest in banking his voice on his dad's behalf. But it's a time commitment for our patients themselves. It's also a time commitment for their family members who have their own families and things, and they just haven't got there with that yet from a time point of view. So it's something we'll find out more about, I think, in time.
Yes, yeah, definitely. As you say, it's a very changing picture, as with a lot of things in AEC, but quite exciting. And I can certainly sense that you're very passionate about getting it right for your patients and keeping up with the current trends. So I think we shall finish now. And I see you've put some references there. And I believe that if anybody did want to contact you with any particular questions, you'd be quite happy to answer them. But I'd just like to conclude and say thank you very much for taking the time to present the webinar. Thanks to everybody for joining us. There will be a recording available of the webinar probably in the next few days. But I'd just like to wish you all well a very pleasant evening. Thank you and goodbye.